Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Ty, and I will be your moderator. This event, The Hidden Costs of Status Quo and Delaying the Decision to Find a New HCM Solution, is being presented by HR Morning and is sponsored by PayPro. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box in the control panel. If they're regarding the subject being presented, I'll add them to the queue for questions at the end. Now I'd like to introduce your speaker, Patrick Sayers.
Thanks, Ty. Thanks for joining us, everyone. As Ty mentioned, we're going to cover the hidden costs of status quo, the price of delaying your decision to find a new HCM solution. We're going to cover a tremendous amount of ground today, or try to. So if you have questions at the end, I'm going to get right to the content. If you have questions at the end, definitely feel free to ask. If there are, the way I design these presentations is how I would like it if I was in the audience. So I would like to see a lot of material covered, a lot of ground. If you want to go more in depth in any one topic, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be at the end. I welcome those conversations. I promise it is not a sales pitch. Newcastle Research, actually, that's a good segue because it's always information. It's always good to know, particularly when somebody is making recommendations. It's always good to understand who are they, what do they do, why should I care what they think, why are they an expert, right? So let me just spend a couple minutes on Newcastle Research, what we do, so you understand kind of why we're experts in this area. So we do a lot of things, but what the core of what we do is helping customers choose the best human capital management solution for their needs, right? So our focus is on understanding the market. So this representative set that you see here is not, they're not all the players in the market. They should not be interpreted as a recommendation. They're just here for illustrative purposes to understand, like, okay, these are the folks that we cover, right? So that's one half of what we do, though, in terms of our knowledge base. The other focus is, we have to understand all the players in the market, right? So we regularly sit in on, demos from all the players that you see there and more, to understand the mechanics, what they're rolling out, understand what their, their product, timeline is going to be, what they're going to be rolling out next quarter, next year. But that's really only half the battle. It's the other half is understanding the customer, right? And what I mean by the customer is not just the customers that we work with. So we work with customers in a lot of different capacities. The most common one is helping customers develop a short list of HCM options that make sense for them, and we'll cover that. But I'm talking about understanding the customer more generally, right? So the example I always give is, you might have two customers at a user conference for a particular HCM vendor, and one of them might be really happy and one of them might be really unhappy. And on paper, they might look very similar, right? They might have, the same number of employees. They might be in the same geography. They might even be in the same industry. So that, in a nutshell, kind of illustrates or explains what Newcastle Research does, right? So it's our job to understand, why is that one customer unhappy and why is that other one happy, right? Because that's not something you can just glean, from looking at a website or just reading a marketing brochure from any of these HCM vendors. It's understanding that path, right, that they took, and oftentimes it's not so much who they picked, but understanding kind of the process they took to get there. So we talk to customers all the time, which is why I always extend the invitation. If you want to cover any of the topics that we're going to cover today in more detail, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to have that conversation. It's valuable for me to understand, what organizations are thinking about. If they're unhappy with a particular vendor, why are they unhappy, right? What are they unhappy with? If they're happy with a vendor, like, by all means, give me a call and tell me why you're happy. And those follow-up calls are designed to be mutually beneficial. The benefit for you is understanding, if you are looking, what should I be asking? What should I be watching out for? I try very hard not to mention any HCM vendors by name in these kind of public webinars, but I can give you a lot more insight, into kind of behind the scenes stuff, kind of off the record, if you will. So the way I've structured this presentation is based on the three things we hear most often, right? From the organizations that we work with, and also in terms of formally engaged, they pay us to help them with their search, with preparing them for the board meeting where they have to present, or for a chief human resources officer. That's a common engagement that we do, is to help them prepare to pitch the idea of a new HCM or the need for a new HCM system to their CFO, to their president, to their CEO. So if a company is delaying their search for a new HCM solution, because sometimes they're not, but to the extent they are delaying that, which is kind of the theme of this presentation, these are the three things we typically hear, right? So one is what I just mentioned, that the CFO needs to be convinced that a new HCM solution is needed, right? So the CHRO understands her organization needs a new HCM solution, but she needs to put together a compelling case to convince the other members of leadership. And CFO, by the way, is not, that's just the most common one, but it's not always the CFO. I don't want to characterize CFOs unfairly, like, oh, they're just the bean counters, they don't want to do anything. But it's typically the CFO that needs to be convinced. But sometimes it's, as I mentioned, I was working with a customer last quarter, and I helped them prepare, in addition to helping them create a short list of HCM options that made sense for them, I also helped them prepare that pitch for the board, right? And so it's not always the CFO, sometimes it's the president, sometimes it's the CEO, sometimes it's a board, but the theme here is, the concept here is convincing someone else that needs to be convinced within the organization that you need a new solution. The second thing we hear is, we're just not, number two here, we're just not sure the best way to conduct our search, right? They're kind of lost, they're kind of treading water. And typically the organization is in one of two camps, in the bottom bullets there. They're either coming off, not always, but this represents probably 95% of the situations when they say, they're like, oh, we just need some help. They're coming off some homegrown system, and they've just never looked at, a formal HCM system, right? They just don't know it's a new experience for them. And the other one is, they're on a system today and they're miserable. And they made a mistake picking that one, and they really don't understand how, like what did they do wrong? And so I call him intern Timmy. He raises his hand. At some point in the process, they're miserable. They just picked a system 2 years ago, say, and they're starting to do the same search again, right? And so intern Timmy raises his hand and says, this is exactly what we did 2 years ago, and we're miserable today. Like, why are we doing the same thing? Let's get some help, right? And so then that's kind of the second element of people reaching out and saying, hey, we need some help. And then the third one is just, they don't have time, right? They just, if they're in, and I get it, I really do. I talk to HR professionals, HR managers, HR practitioners, HR directors, VPs, SVPs, chief people officers, chief human resources officers. Those are the folks that I talk to every day, right? And so I really do get your pain. Like, if you are using a system today, if you're not using a system today and you need a system, or you're using a system today that is not working efficiently for your needs, you have more work on your plate than you know what to do with. And I get it. I understand your pain. And so I do get that concept of, I don't have time, right? So let's focus on that one just for one moment. We can help organizations, and this isn't a sales pitch, I'm just going to explain why I'm not going to cover this one today. We do help organizations with that. We could save organizations a significant amount of time by taking a lot of that off of their plate and handling a lot of the search for you, and just creating a list that makes sense, rather than organizations kind of spinning their wheels. And I'll give you a perfect example. We're working with a large restaurant chain, national restaurant chain, and when they engaged with us, the first call, she said, I talked to her for about a half hour, and this was the chief human resource officer, and she said, yeah, we spent like last 3 to 6 months whittling down. We looked at these 10, and we whittled it down to 3. And I said, well, hang on. I said, let me tell you which 3 you narrowed it down to. And I nailed it. And she was half impressed, but half really upset that she and her team had just wasted 3 months doing what I did in 30 minutes after talking to her about what her needs were. She's like, how did you do that, right? And I said, well, these 3 of those 10 were never going to meet your needs because they can't do X, Y, Z, which you just told me was really important. The other 4, for one reason or another, budget, size, scalability, geography. Like they weren't going to do it, which left the other three. And she was like, great, right? So we can save a lot of time, but that's not something I can't address this one, the three primary reasons here, with a webinar, right? Because this is really a one-way street. I'm talking to you. I need to understand what your needs are in order to save you time. I need to take that off your plate. So we're not going to cover that one today. But we are going to cover these two. And so that's what we're covering today. We're going to cover, the title of the presentation, the cost of delaying the decision. That really gets to the heart of that CFO will say, and again, it's not just the CFO, but it's that conversation with that person in leadership who needs to be convinced, who needs you to quantify, build a case of why we need a new solution today. And then I didn't really feel like it was fair for me to just outline like, here's why you need a new solution and not give you any insight into like, well, where do you go next? So really it's a two-pronged approach, and this is what we're going to cover, is the cost of delaying the decision and also what to consider when you're searching for a new HCM solution. So I'm going to give you 5 considerations. So as I said, we're gonna get right to it, cover a lot of ground. Before we do that, I want to throw out one of 2 poll questions, and this is here for 2 reasons. One, it helps me understand who I'm talking to. So to the extent I understand who I'm talking to, I can kind of tailor my talk today to you. So take a moment to fill that out. It's also there for your benefit, because I think if I were in the audience, it would be interesting for me to see like, what are other people experiencing? What are other people thinking? So I'll give you 30 seconds to fill that out, and then we can continue. And Ty, you could tell me, I can't see the results unless you haven't put them up yet. So you could tell me when you're, maybe you can run through the what we're seeing.
Yep, sure thing. So it looks like 60% answered missing functionality, 20% not easy to use, and then the rest, too many systems, duplicate data entry, etc.
Got it. Okay, perfect. All right, thanks.
You got it?
All right, so let's get back to what we're covering today. As I said, we are going to cover a lot of ground. If you have questions, feel free to reach out after. So we'll start with number 1, cost of delaying a decision to find a new HCM solution. So these are the 4 slides. We're gonna go into each one like that in a moment. But before, and we're always going to use this as our home base for this conversation. So let me explain what you're looking at here. I wanted to do 2 things. I wanted to talk about the particular topics, and we're going to go into each one of these slides. I'm going to give you some examples, walk you through it. But this you can view as a framework for, like, if you are a chief human resources officer, if you're an HR director, if you are in a position where you need a new HCM system, but there are other entities, other people in your organization who need to be convinced of that, this is a great framework for that conversation. And so we'll give examples. I'm going to walk through it and talk a little bit about each one of these, but take a screenshot of this. I have this conversation because you might need to have that conversation once every 3, 4, 5 years, right? I have this conversation probably 100 times a year, right? So I have this conversation. Sometimes, if people work with us, formally, sometimes I will have this conversation with the CFO, with the board, with the president, with the CEO on behalf of HR, right? To say, hey, here's why you need this, right? So I'm the ally in that regard. Sometimes I go in with HR and talk to them with HR, and sometimes I just prepare HR to have this conversation. But this is a great foundation for that talk. These are the pillars that I like to hit, depending on how big your screen is. The it's a mix of direct cost savings and indirect cost savings and potential cost savings. But if you hit a bunch of different elements, a bunch of different pain points, it can really be quite compelling. So let's go into each one of these. So payroll errors, that's kind of the clearest, cleanest direct cost savings, which is generally speaking gonna, those direct hard cost savings are really gonna be appealing to a CFO. It's gonna help justify the expense of a new system if you need one. And so when I talk about payroll errors, and again, any one of these kind of subject slides I could spend an hour talking about this. I could spend an hour talking about compliance, right? I could spend an hour talking about the consolidation, right? So any of these topics are really deserving of a more in-depth conversation. But as I said, I really like to cover a lot of ground in these webinars to try to make them as valuable as possible. So I don't want you to think like this one slide, that's everything you need to know about payroll errors. That's not the case. But I just wanted to give you mostly the framework and an understanding of how to approach that conversation and give you some real world examples of that. So this is one, direct cost savings. I'm not going to talk a lot about where payroll errors come from. If you are in HR and payroll, you are aware of that, right? Erroneous deductions, not tracking employees' hours correctly, miscalculations in overtime, tax withholdings, all of that. But just to give you a quantifiable approach, because really when you're building an ROI case for a new system, that's really what the rest of the executive team is looking for. Like, how do we quantify this? Like, really, we have to justify this expense, this line item. Give me some numbers, right? And so there are studies out there, APA, the American Payroll Association, have suggested, revealed, might be a better term, that upwards of 8% of a payroll error accounts for 8% of total payroll if you're not using a system, right? If you're just on paper, if you will, it can be quite high. If you're using some kind of system, it can be still be as high as say 2%, right? And people look at that and they're like, oh, 2%, that's not that's not huge. That's a huge significant. Like going from paper, or no sophisticated system to a sophisticated system, on average generates a huge ROI, right, in terms of reducing payroll error. But this example that I laid out here illustrates even smaller incremental changes. Like if you're using a system today, but it can get a little bit better, you could get a little bit more efficient. In the blue box, they're reducing the average payroll error rate just by 0.5%, going from 1.25% to 0.75%. That would result in $22,550 a year per 100 employees. And that's based on the most recent US Bureau of Labor Statistics average national weekly earnings rate of 11.02 and 1 cent, right? So what I did was I took that average, multiplied it by 50 weeks, multiplied it by 100 full-time employees, times that 0.5% of payroll error difference, and that results in that. And that's really going to appeal to a CFO. I can tell you from experience that that's going to open some eyes to say, okay, then they start to quantify the need for it. And a good way to estimate that, because there's really two buckets, right? If a payroll error can be, I'm oversimplifying a bit, but it can be in the favor of the employee or it can be in favor of the company, right? And I use that term loosely because if you're shortchanging employees, that's really not in favor of the company, but it can be a mistake, on the plus side, it could be a mistake on the bottom side. Generally speaking, typically companies will have much better visibility into the errors that shortchange employees, because employees will bring that to the attention of payroll and HR and say, hey, I worked more hours last week, right? Or I did this, or you miscalculated time off, or you took too much out of here, and so the company will fix that and make the employee whole. So they have typically companies have tremendous visibility into the errors that shortchange employees. So not always, like if an employee gets, not always, employees will sometimes bring a mistake in their favor to the company's attention, but typically that's less frequent, right? So an employee gets something, oh, that's higher than it was last week. That's great, right? So companies typically underestimate the errors on that shortchange the company, right? So what you do is, at a high level, you take the visibility that you have, where the error was in favor of the employee and then fix to make the employee whole, and you just multiply that by 2, right? And that gives you gives you some insight. It's a good estimate for kind of your total error rate. And so that's a good way to calculate. And these are the exercises that I do with companies. This isn't the primary thing we do. The primary thing we do is helping companies develop a short list of HCM vendors that make sense for them so that they're in a better position going forward. But so this is one. That's a good foundational conversation to have, is the direct cost savings, trying to reduce those payroll errors. The second kind of foundational topic, to take in that ROI conversation really gets to the heart of time. And really, the productivity and self-service can be treated as two different conversations, but I lump them for simplicity here into one. And really what I'm talking about is the goal is to reduce or even eliminate the time that payroll and HR professionals are spending on tasks, enabling that staff to focus on more strategic work. Conceptually, this is sometimes a tougher sell to the CFO because it's not a hard dollar saving. It's not like, okay, we're paying X today and now we're going to pay Y tomorrow. It's more about freeing up, HR and payroll practitioners, professionals, leadership to focus on more strategic things, right? And so the productivity element is, basically I'm spending, because this task is not fully automated, or let's say it's automated, 25% of it is automated. But if we get a better system or a system, if they're coming off of paper today, that same task could be 75% automated, right? So that's going to free up X amount of hours per week, right? And so the way to run that, and this is designed to, we can help do this with you, but this presentation, this webinar today is designed, I'm trying to arm you so that you can go do this yourself, right? So the productivity one, that involves calculating the ROI, involves determining how long specific tasks currently take. And then you have to estimate what percentage of that task is currently automated and what percentage is predicted to be automated with a technology improvement, right? And so that example I just gave, hey, this is 25% automated today. It could be 75% automated, so that 50% delta, that represents whatever, X hours per week. And so that's a savings. Not a savings of hard dollars, but it's a savings of time, right? And so the self-service, similarly, hey, today, every time somebody needs to, take time off, they're calling us, right? Instead, we'd like to make that, a self-service endeavor, and that's going to free up our time. It's still going to take, rather than taking 10 minutes, it's going to take, this person, 5 minutes. That's going to free up, 10 minutes of our week. So anyway, the net of it is it's going to save HR's time. And really the pitch here is, because increasingly HR and payroll, that whole function is being asked to be more strategic. And that's not, we can spend an hour, just talking about that. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know. If you go to SHRM, HR tech, this is a steady theme for the last, decade, at least, probably 2 decades, is HR taking on a more strategic role, right? And so, but that's a very real thing. And it's a welcome sign that the rest of the C-suite is really starting to see that, which is nice, right? And I was just looking up a study this morning. So one angle, and this is an angle that I took last month with a company, because the CEO was like, the CFO was like, well, we're paying those HR payroll practitioners X today. I'm still going to be paying them X tomorrow. That's not a saving. I said, no, it really is, because if let's say you take, in the example we took with them, because I just talked with a company recently about this. They were talking about the adjustment runs, right? If they make a mistake, it's not just the direct savings, but how much time is your team spending on those adjustment runs? And they estimated they were probably doing, with the new system, they could save an adjustment run per month, right? And so that's 5 hours. They estimated 5 hours for that adjustment run in time, not in the direct savings of reducing the errors, but in the time it took to fix them. So 5 hours a month that the team was spending. So that's 60 hours a year, right? So what if they could take that 60 hours a year and focus more on, increasing employee engagement? And so that's the pitch that really resonated with the CFO, because employee engagement, study after study after study show that increased employee engagement reduces absenteeism, it reduces turnover, it reduces safety incidents, it reduces quality defects. If you're in healthcare, it reduces patient safety, incidents. It increases customer satisfaction, it increases productivity, it increases profitability, right? So that's, if you can free up your HR and payroll team's time to do more strategic things by taking the tactical things off their plate or reducing them, that's going to directly help the company's bottom line and top line. So that's kind of foundational, foundational message number 2. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. The third is the human capital management technology consolidation. And then again, this is really one of those fairly easily quantified things. And what I'm talking about here is today, you're using actually that healthcare company, or not, sorry, that restaurant chain that I mentioned is a good example of this as well. Today, they're using like 8 different systems, right? And so when I started the conversation, they were like, yeah, we're already using all these things today, and we can't really justify it. It's difficult to justify another system. And I'm like, well, you're not really talking about another system, because that other system is going to, eliminate the need for 8 of these other systems, right? So you might be paying, for example, $10 a month for, per employee per month. I'm making up a number, but $10 per employee per month for one specific thing, like might be an onboarding tool or recruiting tool, right? And so, but if this complete HCM system can also do that, that might be a $5 per employee per month add-on, right? And so, even though you're introducing a new system, you're eliminating the need for maybe 5 or 6 other systems, and the standalone cost of those other systems is baked into the new system at a lower rate, right? And so, often the combination of those costs, that you're currently paying today for all those different systems add up, to more than the proposed cost of that single unified solution. And that's an immediate hard dollar cost savings, which is really going to appeal to a CFO. And the last one is compliance risk. And admittedly, this is the most difficult one to quantify, because it's really kind of the specter of an audit, a penalty, a potential lawsuit. But this is a really compelling one. Quantifying, as I said, compliance risk is not an easy exercise. A good approach is to outline, the areas of potential cost in non-compliance and assign likelihood percentages. And even if those likelihood percentages are low, the potential cost can be very high of being non-compliant. And this is even without a hard certifiable, like, oh, we do this, we're going to save X amount next year, because the CFO or the C-suite, the rest of the C-suite might be like, well, we haven't incurred any fines. What can often be a compelling talk track is preparedness, right? So are you prepared? If we were to be audited today, are you ready for that, right? What is your exposure today? And sometimes just the lack of being able to address how exposed you are today to something like an audit, penalty, potential lawsuit is eye-opening enough for a lot of folks. And this is particularly eye-opening, for smaller companies who are coming off of paper. As I say, that they're playing with Excel spreadsheets today. They have literally paper records, and sometimes it's just not enough, right? And so the compliance risk is not easy to quantify, but very, very compelling. And so those are the 4 kind of foundations I have for those conversations, and they typically work very well. Okay, and so before we get to number 2, we're going to run through what to consider when you're searching for a new HCM solution. And again, I know I covered all that very quickly. If you have additional questions, feel free to reach out. I'll have my contact information at the end. But as I said, I wanted to, at its core, give you a foundation for that conversation internally, so to prepare you so you can go do that yourself. But I'm happy to help. But before we get to number 2, let's do another quick poll. What is the most important criteria in selecting your next HCM solution? The tie again. Once you see enough, you can tell me what the results say.
Absolutely. Yep. So we'll give it about another 10 seconds. All right. Let's see here. Bit of a spread here. So 73% answered features and functionality, 9% answered price, 36 ease of use, 9% customer service, and 36% consolidation.
Okay, perfect. And it's always interesting to see how those two polls line up. The first one addresses like, why are you in pain today? And then what are you looking for? It's always interesting that typically I see customer service being a bigger pain point on the first poll, but it never fails that customer service is a larger percentage of why they're in pain today versus what they're looking for. And I'll cover that because that's one of the elements that we're going to cover. But yeah, customer service is a tough one to quantify, and I'm going to give people a cheat sheet for that today. So the second half of what we're covering today, what to consider when you're searching for a new HCM solution. So now that, under number one, now that you're able to convince the rest of your organization that you need a solution, where do you go next, right? And so that's what these, again, take a screenshot here. Like if you ask these 5 questions in your search, you are going to significantly increase your chance of success. I promise you that. So I'm happy to have a conversation. This gets to the real heart of what we help organizations do. But even if you don't engage with someone like a Newcastle Research, ask these questions, and as I said, you're going to significantly increase your chance of success. So these are 5 questions to ask when evaluating human capital management solutions. So what's the right HR technology vehicle? This one, I would assume most of the people on the call are going to be in the camp of using a SaaS HCM, software as a service, cloud HCM solution, right? So a tool that lives in the cloud that your team is going to use versus a PEO is a professional employer organization. That's kind of a mutual or a joint employer situation. HRO, where you're kind of outsourcing your entire HR function. There's a time and place. So anyway, long story short, most of the people on the call are going to be in that HCM camp. But this is an important enough question to cover because it can be really debilitating when I see it out in the wild. So I'll have a customer conversation, for example, and they'll say, yeah, we've been doing a lot of work. We've reduced it down to these 3 options, right? And they might be looking at the human capital management solution, a PEO, and an HRO. And like the slide here indicates, they are 3 very, very different vehicles designed to do very, very different things, right? And so if you're by all means, there is a time and place for an HCM system. There's a time and place for a PEO. There's a time and place for a fully outsourced HRO solution. But they're very, very different things. Like here we have a Tesla. I think that's a Ducati and a Range Rover, right? 3 great vehicles, right? But they are designed to do very different things. So by all means, explore them, but you're going to have to eventually narrow it down to the best vehicle. And then once you've decided on a vehicle, decide which vehicle or which brand, if you will, which in this case, human capital management company, is the best option within that vehicle type. Because if the final decision is between 3 completely different types of vehicles, then the search didn't reflect your needs, right? So decide on a type of HR vehicle that best fits your needs, and then evaluate options within that category. So if that's a PEO, then your final search should be down to a few different PEOs, right? If it's HCM, the cloud-based software as a service, your final decision should be between 3 like animals, if you will. So as I said, most of the topics we're going to cover today are focused on that HCM because I think that's what most people on the call are going to care about. But that one, when I see it, it's compelling enough, it's disruptive enough to their search that it's worth calling out. So the second question is the solution single HCM or integrated? And so the first thing that is always important is to kind of define these, right? Because depending on who you're talking to, the definition will vary, right? So a single HCM, because in a lot of customers that I coach, that I talk to, I just had a customer call me back the other day, and she said, "Thank you so much for the coaching." She said, "Well, I'll get to that anecdote in a moment." The single HCM is built from the ground up on a single code base, right? So there's one employee record. multi-tenant system. An integrated HCM is applications that were developed and built separately and that brought together, right? And so just because you are engaged in conversation going through a demo with one HCM vendor, and that's a brand, and the solution they're presenting is branded as one thing, doesn't mean that it's a single HCM, right? It could be an integrated HCM built built through acquisition, right? It could, for example, you're engaged with HCM vendor XYZ, right? And they're presenting a complete HCM solution, including the onboarding, the recruiting, the payroll, the HR, time and attendance, everything, right? But there might be 3 different systems behind the scenes, right? Because they just acquired that, talent management system last year, and they're partnering, unbeknownst to you, perhaps with someone else for time and attendance, but it's being rebranded. So you really have to be careful. And I've had customers call me back and tell me, yeah, we asked if it was a single HCM, and the account executive, the salesperson we were talking to, oh, absolutely, it's completely integrated, right? So the salesperson knows that they're not really answering the question in the spirit in which it was asked, but they fool a lot of customers that way. And most sales executives are honest, right? But you really got to be careful to understand what you're buying, because and this gets to the heart of the second line. Here, why does it matter? So a single HCM, it requires one update. There's no need to manually enter and update data into separate systems. So the analogy I use, or the imagery I use, is, I live in New England, and there are very few must-haves for buying a car here, right? Any car will get you from point A to point B, but in New England, I would have a really tough time not buying an all-wheel drive car. So that's a very close to a must-have for me. Similarly, if I'm looking at an HCM system, or if I'm advising a customer on kind of the best thing for them, a single HCM is really pretty close to a must-have for me, because the ripple effect is just so great, the difference between a single HCM. And so a lot of customers that I talk to, or all the customers that I talk to, when they call and they're unhappy with their system, I always ask why they're unhappy, right? Because I need to understand how to help them, right? Why are you in pain today? And so a lot of times, the reason they're in pain today, the cause of that pain is not always apparent. So they're saying, oh, we hate our customer service. Customer service is terrible, right? And so when we really kind of pull back the layers of the onion, sometimes the reason that their customer service is terrible gets all the way back to the architecture, because they're not on a single system. And so a lot of times the customer is unaware of that relationship. So I'll talk to them. I just had a conversation recently about exactly this, where the customer was like, yeah, we call, and sometimes they're really, really good about the answer, and sometimes they don't. It doesn't seem like they have any idea what they're talking about. And I said, well, the reason is because they actually don't have any idea what they're talking about when you call in about a time and attendance question, because they don't own that technology, right? They are partnering with a third party for that time and attendance functionality, that time and attendance module. And they're like, I didn't know that. And I'm like, no, they try very hard to hide that fact. And so when you call in and you have, for example, a payroll question, that's great, because that's in their wheelhouse. That's their company that is offering that. But when you call in for a time and attendance question, they have to go to that third party partner and ask them, and then you get to that game of telephone. And so that's a perfect example of why a source of pain is not always apparent, right? So in this case, it was customer service. They were unhappy with the response time. They were unhappy with the level of knowledge, in specific functional areas. And the reason is because it's not a single HCM. So this is a huge ripple effect. If there's one kind of big, must-have for me, or something very close to a must-have, there better be a really good reason. Similar to the car example that I gave you, if I'm not going to get an all-wheel drive car here in New England, there better be a really good reason for it, right? I better be getting a really good price, or it needs to be like a second car, like a convertible or something for the summer. So similarly, if you're not going to go with a single HCM, there better be a really, really good reason for it. Okay. Moving on, just going to take a quick look at time. We're doing okay. The third one I want to cover is a reseller situation, good or bad, and 2 situations that you want to avoid. And so by reseller situation, that example that I just gave, and that gets to situation number 1, right? Customer buys a solution from a single provider, it's a single brand, and they assume it's a single system. And the reality is a core component is delivered through a third party or has recently been acquired. So even though that HCM vendor XYZ that you're dealing with, that you're talking with, even though they own it, they just bought it last month, last week, last quarter, and it's kind of Frankenstein behind the scenes, to splice together, but it's really going to behave as two separate systems. And the result is the customer experience is disconnected workflows, disconnected user experience. And again, the example that I just went over, the support for that one module isn't as good as the other modules, and that's the reason why, is because that's a reseller situation that is potentially a red flag, right? But on the flip side, situation number two is you can go to the extreme on the other end of the spectrum, right? The customer doesn't include any resellers in the search, right? Why would I buy from a reseller when I can buy directly from the software developer? And so the result is the customer eliminates from consideration what could be a better option. And what I mean by that is determine first what is being resold, right? So if it's the example the first example that I gave, where it's an HCM provider who is farming out, or partnering for one module, or they recently acquired one module, true module. So there's really truly 2 or 3 different systems behind the scenes that are kind of spliced together. That's not a unified solution, right? And so there are a host of problems. In that last slide, when I talked about the single solution, we talked about the ripple effect in customer service, but things like reporting, right? So if they're on different systems, you're going to have to lay over like an IBM Cognos system on top of that to draw from the different databases. It's going to result in potential human error, because you're going to have to manually enter dual enter data into different systems. So that we could talk for an hour just about the pros and cons of a single system. Mostly the cons, or I'm sorry, mostly the cons of a multiple database system behind the scenes. But if a company is reselling an entire unified solution, that can actually be a really good thing. And that's the situation number two that you want to avoid. You don't want to dismiss companies just because they're a reseller, because sometimes they can be better. And one of the companies that I mentioned, I'm not going to mention them by name, but there are companies that I recommend who are resellers over the company that built the product, because they're selling the exact same product. It literally lives in the same data center. It's the same exact thing, but they add better customer service. And that comes as a surprise to some organizations that I talked to that I would recommend a reseller. But there are, long story short, there are situations where a reseller situation is a red flag, a caution for me. And there are situations where it's actually could be the better option. So you really have to dive in and understand what is being resold and why, right? And what I mean by why is it a long-term, relationship, a long-term partnership that they're reselling, or is it kind of a stopgap until they grow out their own homegrown solution? So reselling situations can be detrimental, they can be beneficial depending on the situation. You really dive into understand why. And at the risk of sounding, at the risk of kind of having this be perceived as a sales pitch, it can be really difficult for organizations to figure that out on the fly, because these organizations, the HCM vendors, will go to great lengths to hide the fact that they resell some stuff. So you can call someone like me, but if you don't want to do that, go through the 10K. To the extent they're publicly traded, the 10K is the annual report. Sometimes you can glean a lot from that. So do some digging. Don't just take companies at their word that it's a single solution. Okay, fourth one. What is the implementation plan? Take a quick look at time. So confusion around the implementation is a recipe for disaster. So as I said, if a company makes their way to me, either in a formal engagement or just in a kind of mutually beneficial free webinar follow-up call, very rarely will a company call me just to tell me how much they love their system, right? If somebody, I would say this, if someone makes their way to me, it means they're unhappy, right? They want to talk about, how do we fix this? How do I, get out of this pain that we're in with our current HCM system? So I get tremendous visibility into why people are unhappy with their system, right? And so, as I mentioned before, I always try to get to the heart of, well, why are they unhappy, right? So what went wrong? When did it go wrong? And when it went wrong is it's amazing how often the relationships started to sour before they were even up and running on the system, right? So they were really excited, they went with the system, they decided, they signed on the bottom line, and then they got to implementation and the relationship went south and it never recovered, right? So they started to hate the HCM vendor they were working with before they even went live, right? And so a lot of times that, things start to go off the rails during the implementation, right? And so it's impossible to guarantee that that the implementation will go well or with any vendor, but things can go wrong, but you can significantly increase your chance of success by really paying attention to what the plan is for that implementation. So what to look for. The vendor that you're working with or thinking about working with should have a detailed plan, right? So what resources should the customer expect to commit in terms of time, in terms of staff? What is the vendor's responsibility and what is the customer's responsibility? So they should have a very, very detailed plan. They should be able to outline milestones, time frame, all of that. The real good ones, the honest ones, will be very upfront about how much time you need to commit as the customer, right? Because it's going to take time for your staff to go through this implementation process with the vendor. What to watch out for? Often, as mentioned, often the vendor is largely to blame for not having a good plan or not communicating that plan effectively. Don't accept any, like if you hear any form of like, oh, we do this all the time, we'll figure it out when we get there. You don't need to worry, just sign and we do this all the time. I don't want to say run, but look more closely, right? Oftentimes the implementation will be done by a third party. So don't just ask for timelines, don't just ask for what the plan is. Ask for who is going to be implementing it. Is it the entity that you are signing with, or is it a third party? And if it is a third party, ask for references who have been plugged in by that third party, right? And so being plugged in by a third party is not necessarily a bad thing. There are some companies for whom that's their plan, and so it's always plugged in by a third party. But some other companies will rely on third-party implementers when their bandwidth is such that they can't do it themselves, and so sometimes that third party might be the first or second time they're ever plugging it in. So ask what the plan is, ask who is going to be plugging it in, ask for references who have been plugged in by that third party. So take a real close look at what that implementation plan is. And then the last one I want to cover today is customer service, right? And so I mentioned this before, which is always interesting to see in the polls. Typically when I talk to customers, 2 out of 3 customers cite poor customer service as, if not the primary reason, then one of the top reasons they're switching HCM vendors. And it's always funny to see, because I talk to customers, they're like, yeah, we're switching because of customer service is horrible. And then a couple of weeks later, we get to, deep dive onto like, oh, what are you looking for? Like, what are your requirements? What are your must-haves? What are your nice-to-haves? And oftentimes, even though customer service is their number one pain point today, it's not on their list of what they're looking for. And I kind of joke with them. I'm like, wait, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, you said you were miserable because of customer service, and yet that's not even on your list. And they're, I kind of wait for the crickets to subside, but I let them off the hook, pretty quickly, because customer service is a tough thing to quantify, right? Because every single HCM vendor that you talk to is going to tell you that customer service is their top priority, right? So how do you tell the difference between them, right? They're going to put customer service, customer CSAT metrics in front of you, NPS scores, all of that. And I don't want to dismiss that, those customer satisfaction metrics that they put in front of you, they're important, right? If they say, oh, 95% customer satisfaction, 96% customer satisfaction, this is our net promoter score, blah, blah, blah. Those are good, they're good. But it's always valuable to take a closer look at what those customer satisfaction metrics are, right? So that essentially they poll their customers. Not all of them respond to that survey. And so that 95% customer satisfaction number, when you really dive into it, might mean, okay, 95% of our customers really like us, but the 95% might only represent the 40% that filled out the survey. So 95% of 40% of our customers really like us. Well, my question is always, well, what about the other 60% that didn't fill out the survey? How do they feel? Because I know, because I'm in the research field, another thing that we do is that type of survey. I know that typically that 60%, or maybe as high as 80%, because 20% response rate is actually pretty good. for customer satisfaction survey, they are biased toward being unhappy because a lot of unhappy customers won't bother to fill out the survey. They're just going to leave, right? And so take those CSAT, and Net Promoter Score, take those things with a grain of salt. A truer metric of customer satisfaction, customer service is revenue retention, right? And it kind of intuitively makes sense, right? Because revenue retention captures their entire customer base, A, and it's really gets to the heart of the software as a service, right? Because it's a revenue recurring based model, right? So it's not a case of just them buying one phone or a pen or whatever it is, and then you don't need to buy another one for a while. This is a subscription service, right? So the best way, so their goal, all of these companies who are trying to sell you software as a service, their goal is to keep you as a customer because it's a revenue, subscription based service. So the best way to judge any company who is selling you something as a service is to judge how often customers stay, because customers vote with their dollars, right? So whether it's, HCM vendor XYZ or Netflix selling you movies, like how good are they at keeping customers, right? And so, intuitively it makes sense, right? In the example, I use car analogies a lot because everyone can relate to that. If your neighbor across the street is on their third Toyota Camry over the last, 15 years, you don't need to ask them if they like Toyota Camrys, right? They keep buying them. So it's clear that they like them, right? So similarly, if a customer stays with their HCM vendor, it's a great indication that they like them, right? They like them enough to stay, right? And so always ask for what the customer retention number is. They will often give you a revenue retention number, and that's fine just because that's how most of these companies calculate that. They are different numbers, right? So some quick math, if an HCM vendor, just to use simple math, has 10 customers at the beginning of the year and 9 of those 10 customers are with them at the end of the year, that's 90% customer retention, right? That one customer that left, maybe that one customer represented 50% of their revenue. So an unusually high percentage of the revenue was it was baked in that one customer. So although they have 90% customer retention, they only have 50% revenue retention that year. So they are different calculations. The reason I always tell people, like, don't worry about it. You can treat them somewhat synonymously. It's not a big deal if you ask for customer retention and they give you a revenue retention number. And the reason is for the vast majority of vendors that you are going to be looking at, they have hundreds, thousands of customers. And so as you scale up and you get hundreds, thousands of customers, those two numbers start to look a lot alike, right? So don't bat an eye. Don't worry if they give you a revenue retention number. So what's a good number? That's always the follow-up question. And so my little stoplight imagery here is a good rule of thumb. Most of the vendors that you're going to be looking at in the SaaS HCM space are in that 90 to 94% revenue retention. That's kind of average, which is, you have to kind of do away with the grade school, scale that we all grew up with, because people say like, 90 to 94%, that's an A minus, it's great. It's average in this space. So 92% say. Anything below 90, you really got to take a closer look. Sometimes there's a reason for it, right? So if a company has something in the mid 80s, say, if the vast majority of their customers are SMB customers, that could influence that, right? And so there is sometimes a reason for it, because a lot of SMB customers go out of business statistically. So if you're focused on SMB customers and a lot of those go out of business, they have left technically, but it's not really your fault, right? So there's sometimes a reason, but always look closer. Once you get above like 94% and above, that is really, really elite territory. So if you can get it, that's kind of what you should go for. Look for really high revenue retention, because that, as I said, customers vote with their dollars. That's a great indication of, it's a great benchmark. I think the best benchmark for evaluating, quantifying customer service, right? And so I have this conversation a lot with customers. They're like, oh, well, 96% and 92%. Well, one's an A, one's an A minus. They're pretty close. They're really not, right? So if you flip those on its head, a 94% customer retention means 4% attrition. 92% customer retention means 8% attrition. So 8% is double 4%, right? That means twice as many customers are voluntarily heading for the exits every year. That's a huge difference. But the difference is actually even greater when you consider there's a certain percentage of customers that vendors lose year in and year out that are completely out of their control, right? So I'm an HCM vendor. I have a customer. That customer could not be happier, right? But that customer gets acquired by a really, really big company, and that really big company uses a different HCM vendor. I'm going to lose that customer, and there's nothing I can do about it, right? So there's a certain percentage that's out of their control. Companies go out of business, they get acquired, they merge, so on and so forth. I don't know what that number is. No one does, but let's say it's 2%, right? So then the delta between the 96% customer retention and that 2% they can't control is even greater. So the difference between the 96% retention and the 92%, it's actually more than double. It's probably at least triple, right? So there's a huge, huge difference. That 94% and above, they're really, really doing something right there. Okay, I've left 3 minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, Patrick, there are a few questions that came in. However, we'll have to offline.
Okay.
So yeah, so
sorry, I missed time that. I usually try to give 10 minutes at the end, but
you're okay. A lot of good guidance and info as always. I do want to make sure that we do ask at least one because
sure,
multiple people have asked it just with different wording. So what are the pros and cons of going with a smaller HCM vendor versus one of the larger market share leaders?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's tough to paint too broad a brush, but generally speaking, the smaller vendors, what you're going to get with a larger vendor is a bigger R&D budget, right? So bigger companies can spend more to improve their product, and so they tend to have more investment dollars. Means they can stay up with the latest and greatest in the technology, user interface, all that. So our higher R&D budget is good. The con on some of the larger ones is when you get to have tens of thousands of employees, it's a big ship, right? And so sometimes customer service can suffer. On the other end of the spectrum, a smaller company, they might not have the R&D budget, but they tend to be a lot more customer focused. So you tend to have higher investment in technology with the larger companies, but customer service can suffer. Smaller companies, customer service is usually higher, but they don't have as much of an R&D budget. You can find in certain situations the best of both worlds, where you have a smaller company reselling a larger company's technology, and so there are situations where you can marry that best-in-class customer service with super high R&D budget. So there are ways around it, but that's a great question. It probably deserves more than just a couple minutes, but that's kind of at a high level what my take is on that.
Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back to you for any closing remarks before I conclude the program.
Yeah, as I said, I try to make these as valuable as I can. So I know I covered a lot of ground. I try to cast a wide net to make it valuable for everyone in attendance. If you do have questions, if you want to cover any of the topics that we covered in more detail, please feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to have that. I promise it won't be a sales pitch. I always like to hear from customers. I learn as much as the people I talk to. I learn as much from them as they learn from me. So I'm always happy to have those conversations. But no, yeah, thank you. I know you have choices as to how you spend your webinar time, and so I appreciate you tuning in today.
And Patrick, and as I mentioned earlier, in order to remain on schedule, we will respond to the questions that came in by chat via email in a timely manner. So with that, on behalf of HR Morning, I would also like to thank everyone for attending. This concludes our program.